Hi, and welcome back to Workflow. Since the pandemic fundamentally changed the way we live, work, and play, we've had to get used to working remotely. In fact, almost every white collar professional in the Western world spent a fair chunk of their time working from home over the past 18 to 19 months. I absolutely can't believe it's been that long, but yes, it has. Now, while people may have successfully downloaded Zoom, successfully learned how to use Microsoft Teams or Slack, the reality is that having a basketball and a basketball ring do not an NBA basketballer make. Now, the reality is that remote work requires more than just tools. It requires a certain type of workflow to get the absolute best out of yourself. And in today's episode, I'm actually going to talk through something I wrote about at the outset of the pandemic. Now, I wrote about this in an article called The 5 Levels of Remote Work. Now, this article was actually inspired by Matt Mullenweg. Now, Matt Mullenweg is the CEO and founder of Automattic, that's Automattic with two T's, which essentially runs WordPress. Now, if you're not familiar with Automattic, they're essentially the parent company of WordPress. Now, WordPress has over 1,000 employees around the world. It's worth over $3 billion. Its employees are, in fact, scattered across 75 countries, and they don't have a central office. They operate purely asynchronously, which means they don't have too many meetings, they don't have too many phone calls and things of that persuasion. Now, WordPress, if you're not familiar, it basically powers about a quarter of the websites on the internet. Now, if anybody knows anything about getting remote work done right, it's definitely Matt Mullenweg. And this episode is inspired by a conversation that Matt had with Sam Harris on the Making Sense podcast. So today you're going to learn all about remote work and what the difference is between simply doing remote work and really crushing it remotely. Because nowadays, people are working on average longer than ever. In fact, the most recent studies show that people are working on average 1 to 2 hours longer than they were when they were in the office. And that doesn't really make sense because we've cut out the commute. I mean, here in Melbourne, Australia, where I live, the average commute time one way is about 49 minutes. So that's about, say, 100 minutes a day, which is an hour and 40 minutes a day, almost 10 hours a week. Now, despite that commute time being taken out, people are working longer hours. So clearly, simply downloading Zoom and learning how to use Slack isn't solving the problem. The problem comes back to how we work. Now, before we get into the 5 levels of remote work, if you enjoy this podcast, if you like what I'm sharing, please take a moment to subscribe and turn alerts on now. Now, let's get into it. Okay, so level 0. Now, level 0 is all about not being able to work remotely, even if you wanted to. So think about a traditional call center where unless you actually are on site, unless you're plugged into your desktop computer, to the desktop customer service system, you can't actually answer calls, you can't serve customers. So that's an example of level 0 where there is absolutely no way for you to work remotely. Now, of course, nowadays there are customer service tools and systems that empower people to do that, but we're assuming we're talking about an old school customer service setup, many of which still exist in the world, where you need to be on site to handle calls. That's level 0. Level 1, non-deliberate action. So say you have to work from home for whatever reason. Now, if you're at a level 1 organization, typically this means you could probably still get some work done. Perhaps you work off a laptop, perhaps you can do some offline work. If you need to dial into a meeting, you can pick up the phone. If you need to answer questions, if you need to call clients, you can still do that. But there's been no real deliberate effort or intentional thought put into how you work remotely. Level 1 is essentially where most organizations were prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. Level 2, recreating the office online. Now, this is essentially where most organizations are today. They've downloaded Zoom, they've downloaded Slack, and they think the problem's solved. And now they can take what they were doing in the office and simply replicate that in an online environment. So checking email every 6 minutes, Back-to-back meetings, well, they're not taking place in a conference room anymore, but they're taking place via Zoom now. Um, Instant messages, instead of taps on the shoulder, physical taps on the shoulder, which people were subjected to 50 to 60 times a day in a physical office, now it's instant messages. In fact, the average person sends about 90 instant messages via Slack every day. Of course, all of these tools leave us more hyper responsive than ever, wired to the little red dot in Slack or Microsoft Teams, wired to the next email that comes into our inbox, and wired to the next calendar invite for another Zoom call. Now, Matt Mullenweg actually equates what's going on at level 2 with the advent of the radio back in the 1930s. Now, back then, what happened was most of the content was essentially plays adapted for radio or plays spoken over the radio microphone. Of course, new forms of content which were tailor-made for the radio medium were yet to come along. So we're simply at level 2 taking how we worked inside the office and putting that online instead of taking advantage of the online medium to work better and work smarter. And finally, at level 2, people are still more or less expected to work the 9 to 5 hours. They're still more or less expected to be online at the same time as each other, to communicate, to jump on calls at the same time, to respond to emails and messages in a very timely manner. Hyper responsiveness is at the core of a level 2 organization. So if you're at level 2, I'm sorry, but you've still got a long way to go. Level 3, adapting to the medium. So this is where we move on from simply reading out plays over the airwaves and start to create talk shows and start playing music and doing things that are tailor-made for the radio format. Only in our case, we're going to start taking advantage of the online work format. And a big part of this is actually using shared screens or shared repositories, whether that's a shared Google Doc, whether that's using InVision to share user interfaces, whether that's using a platform like Asana with its task boards to share tasks and communicate asynchronously. This is all going to help us develop a better workflow remotely. And in fact, it's also going to help us do away with some of the crossed wires that can come with communicating at the workplace. So for example, if I'm on a Zoom call with you and we are sharing a Google Doc and updating it in real time, there can be no misunderstanding down the track as to you misinterpreting what I said or me misinterpreting what you said, because we're capturing learnings, we're capturing the discussion as we go, and we're also capturing action items, due dates, responsible persons, and things of that persuasion. So it doesn't mean that things won't be victim to communication breakdown, but the likelihood of that is going to be significantly lower. Now, all of these tools, shared screens, shared repositories, that's basically going to help us to work on things without having to be online at the same time. Now, not being online at the same time, like I said, it's fundamental, or at least it's core to the business model at Automattic. And this is why written communication is such a big factor for them, especially when it comes to hiring, given that so much of the communication is done asynchronously through task boards and things of that persuasion. Because if you can't clearly communicate things with the written word, it means that you need to use the spoken word. And if you're using the spoken word, well then, unless you're leaving voice messages for people, which how many voice messages do you really want to listen to over the course of the day, you're not going to be a great communicator in an organization that relies on the written word. So they look at effective writing ability when they are hiring people. So this is not to say that when you try to become more asynchronous with your communication that you stop having meetings or phone calls. Of course not. There are certain things that definitely call for a meeting, especially sometimes it's much easier to get on a 5-minute phone call and solve a problem than it is to go back and forth via Slack or email all day long. And in other cases where we are dealing with what Jeff Bezos calls type 1 decisions, big, hairy, audacious, expensive, irreversible decisions, we definitely want to get a few wise heads around the table, perhaps for an hour or two, to make sure we make the most informed decision. But for most things, asynchronous communication actually works really well. But when we are meeting, it's important that we don't fall into the same traps that we did when we were in the physical office. You know, all those hallmarks of wasted time and consensus seeking and outsourcing accountability that we found in the typical corporate office. This is our opportunity to move away from that, because all that consensus seeking just robs us of a sense of autonomy and control and agency and makes work very unfulfilling. So when it comes to meetings, one, only hold a meeting if it is absolutely necessary. If you're only going to communicate information, most of the time that can be done through email, through Slack, through corporate intranets. It doesn't need to be done in real time. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that. If it's a quarterly meeting where you want the whole organization online to share wins and whatnot that the organization had through that quarter, fair enough. But 99 times out of 100, when we're meeting simply to communicate information one way, that meeting doesn't need to happen. Two, set the meeting to 15 minutes by default. For whatever reason, we've got this thing in our heads that every meeting needs to be 60 minutes by default, which is ridiculous. Most things can be sorted out in 15 minutes. And in fact, when you set yourself a shorter amount of time, it acts as a forcing function, and it forces you to get to the heart of the matter much faster. This is the essence of Parkinson's law. If you give yourself 1 hour to do something, guess what? It'll take 1 hour. If you give yourself 15 minutes to do something, guess what? It'll take 15 minutes. Makes a lot of sense. Now, of course, not only that, but you can improve the process by which people book meetings. So you could use a tool like Calendly or Ask Amy, for example, where you can integrate that with your calendar. Perhaps there's 2 hours a day where you're available for meetings. And if someone wants to call a meeting with you, you send them your Calendly link, for example, they'll find the next 15-minute slot that you're available and they'll book that. That way you can ensure that you have more control over your day and that your entire day doesn't get filled up with meetings, ultimately robbing you of time and focus to get your best work done. Number three, make sure that there is a specific agenda going into the meeting. Very simple, but so often people go into a meeting really unsure what's to be discussed. And as that adage goes, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Number four, invite only necessary participants. The amount of meetings I've been invited to for prospecting reasons, business development calls with potential clients, where 7 or 8 people were on the call from the potential client and I was the only one from my organization. If I had $1 for every single time that happened, probably wouldn't make me a rich man, but I'd have at least an extra $1,000 in the bank. And sometimes it's quite ironic because many of these meetings are to discuss the procurement of productivity training. So clearly these people need help with these things. So essentially what you want to do is invite only necessary people to a meeting, because this is the thing. If you invite 8 people to a 1-hour meeting, that's no longer a 1-hour meeting. That is a 9-hour meeting, including your time. And if you're working for a large organization where you're stealing a lot of time from that company, not only that, but the opportunity cost that comes with not investing the other 8 hours into more important work is very, very high. And when we invite everyone to every single meeting to discuss every single minor issue or question or problem, well, then we're creating a culture where nobody feels comfortable making a decision and taking action on their own. We're depriving people of agency. We're depriving people of the ability to learn. And we're depriving the organization of speed and ultimately a culture of innovation. Typically, in most cases, 2 to 3 people max should be sufficient for most meetings. There will be exceptions to that, but in most cases, if there are 4, 5, 6 people being invited to a meeting, alarm bells should be ringing. Number 5, I mentioned agenda a moment ago, but having a meeting, having a discussion doesn't really matter or doesn't make any sense if we're not going to capture 1, next steps, action items. Number 2, responsible persons, who's going to carry out these action items. And number 3, due dates. We have to keep people accountable. And again, that forcing function comes into play. Now, this is important as well because this avoids boomerang meetings, where we basically meet next week to discuss what we discussed at the previous meeting. That is an absolute waste of resources and a waste of time. So that's level 3. Level 4, asynchronous communication. I'll get to it when it suits me. That's essentially the basis or the nature of asynchronous communication. And I've kind of touched on this a little in this video already, but essentially, most things don't require more than one person to be online at the same time to get them done. If we build a culture where we are hyper responsive, where we're checking email every 6 minutes, which is the average, if we're switching screens every 20 seconds, if we're sending 90 Slack messages a day, well, people won't have any time to get into flow, which is a topic we've discussed previously. And in those environments, you're depriving people of the ability to do their best work. In fact, you're depriving them of the ability to do the work that you hired them to do in the first place. Now, when we create a culture of asynchronous communication, we're giving people more time to think, more time to focus, and more time to get great work done. Because every time they're distracted, every time they switch tasks, it can take them about 23 minutes to get back into flow or deep work or the zone, whatever you want to call it. So it's imperative that we create a culture where people are free to actually think. Not only that, but when you run asynchronous communication organizations, when you use shared tools, be they task boards and things of that persuasion, you're effectively empowering people to design days that best suit them. So some people might want to start work earlier, some people might want to start work later. And if you're wondering, well, we still need to communicate, that's fine. Think of it as a Venn diagram. There are going to be people who perhaps want to start work at midday, others who want to start work early. There's still going to be an overlap. There's still going to be an opportunity to communicate. Some of that communication may take place real time, but a lot of it should take place asynchronously. Another benefit of asynchronous communication is it takes emotion out of the equation. It takes groupthink out of the equation. Because if we're always making decisions in real time, perhaps in meetings, there is an expectation that I should respond immediately, that I need to demonstrate that I know something, even though I may not. There may also be emotion in play. Now, as Robert Greene, author of books like The 48 Laws of Power and The 33 Strategies of War, someone I've been lucky enough to interview in an episode of the Future Squared podcast, as he likes to say, when you increase response time, you're cutting emotion out of the equation. And not only that, but you're giving people more time to think, to come back with a more thoughtful response. So ultimately, when you extrapolate that out across many decisions across an entire organization, people make better decisions than what they typically would in a real-time setting around a conference room or a boardroom table. Now, of course, when you're sending asynchronous communication messages, there are certain things you definitely need to think about. Now, what those things are is one, you want to provide sufficient background detail about what you're requesting. Number two, you want to provide a due date of some kind. And number three, you want to provide a path of recourse in case they're not quite sure what's going on. So for example, if I was writing a message to my colleague, it might go along the lines of something like this. Hey Shay, attached is the incorporation document for our new spin-off company. Please sign the document where requested and send it back to me by 4 p.m. this Friday. If you have any concerns, give me a call on 555-1983. Simple example of an asynchronous message. Now, companies that truly practice asynchronous communication, they've stepped out of the industrial revolution. They're no longer conflating presence with productivity or hours with output. They are basically leveraging the nature of work today, which is knowledge work, which is predominantly online. They're leveraging the medium to become a lot more effective at what they do, and not just more effective, but give their people more agency and give their people more fulfilling lines of work. And also, when you empower people to make decisions, that is a significant competitive advantage. I mean, if you've got 100 people making decisions, taking action, learning, improving, they're going to make a lot more progress than, say, a team of 100 people who have to call 10 people to a meeting every time they need to make a small decision. So asynchronous communication is a massive competitive advantage for organizations that get it right. And remote work definitely empowers it. Now, if you're unsure what tools to use to practice asynchronous communication, some tools I like, Asana is definitely one of my favorites, along with, say, Monday, Basecamp, Trello. These will give you access to task boards where you can essentially provide comments, questions to your colleagues without having to be online at the same time. You can see how tasks are progressing, how a project is progressing, and that way it just serves to decrease the communication overhead significantly. And level 5, Nirvana. Even Matt Mullenweg concedes that his organization isn't at level 5, but at level 5, He basically says this is where your distributed or your remote team operates better than an in person team ever could. Now, perhaps I'd like to argue that most in person teams I've seen don't operate all that well, but perhaps that's because I've worked with a lot of large traditional corporate organizations where many people are effectively profiteering or benefiting based on legacy business models, based on legacy brands, and perhaps are falling victim to short-termism, short-term bias because things are good now, but ultimately, as we've seen with so many other organizations that went the way of the dodo over the last 10 years, just because you're making money today doesn't mean you'll be making money long into the future. In fact, InnoSight, the innovation management consultancy, released a report where they found that about 50% of today's S&P 500 companies will be replaced on that index in the next 10 to 15 years alone. Of course, there are numerous cons when it comes to remote work, and these are something that we'll unpack in a separate episode. So if you want to learn more about remote work, I've actually published a 60-page ebook called The Remote Working Playbook. Now, you can download that over at steveglaveski.com/downloads. You'll also find a whole bunch of other ebooks and resources at that URL. So, remote work, for the moment, it's still a privilege. I mean, we're still seeing so many organizations start to send people back to the office on a hybrid model for 2 to 3 days a week. But if we can essentially be more intentional about how we work and demonstrate to the powers that be, to leaders, to managers, that we're actually more productive away from the office, well, perhaps we can earn the right to work remotely or to work wherever we want, whenever we want, forever. And that, to me, is where we want to get to. With that, I'm going to bring this episode of Workflow to a close. Adios.